Now, I get a magazine called Voice of the Martyrs. Anyone ever seen that before? Voice of the Martyrs. It started many years ago, and it actually highlights believers and Christians all around the world that are persecuted for their faith. And they always have a prayer list of countries and people to pray for. And it's a reminder that Christianity in places in the world not only is not accepted, but Christianity is actively persecuted, and there are places in the world where people are arrested and thrown into prison and sometimes beaten and tortured for something as simple as having a Bible study in their own home. And I wonder, when I think about that, I wonder about the strength of the faith of people like that, and sometimes I wonder what might I do and how might I react if we lived in a place where it was not considered the respectable thing to be a Christian. And I wonder if some of those sorts of thoughts isn't what some of the people that we read about here in the beginning of Exodus, if that isn't the sort of thing that they faced as well. I'm going to start a new series this morning looking at the life of Moses, and one of the things that I like to do is track with the theme for LTC. And the theme this year is the life of Moses. You can see that a little bit better. The theme is the life of Moses. And I want to begin with the first two chapters and actually dwell on them this morning. And when we think of Moses, if we think of anyone that had a strong faith, someone that reminds us that God is with us, we think of Moses as a strong person. He's someone that went and faced down Pharaoh. He delivered a group of slaves out of slavery and led them through the desert. And he talked to God as one would talk to a friend. But we don't have that picture here in the first two chapters of Exodus, which represents many years. You know, sometimes people around the world have to go underground in order to worship. And I remember back during the years of the Soviet Union, there were Christians there that worshipped and served God underground in China, in Pakistan, North Korea, and a lot of other places like that in the world. And sometimes people, in dealing with their faith and their questions and their doubt, wonder, where is God and when is He going to do something? And I think those are the sort of the questions that we can deal with as we look at the text for this morning. So let's start reading from Exodus chapter 1, the first 11 verses here. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, and they came each one with his household. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number, but Joseph was already in Egypt. Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly, and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. Now, a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or shrewdly with them, or else they will multiply, and in the event of war, they will also join themselves to those who hate us, and fight against us, and depart from the land. So they appointed taskmasters over them, to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. And so the first scene we see here is this paranoia of Pharaoh. He realizes, as all these people that have come up from Egypt, that they have multiplied. Now that would have been a good thing to the former king, because we know, if you go back and look at Joseph, you see how he rescued the people from famine, when God gave them the vision that the famine was going to come, and so they prepared for that. But this new king doesn't know anything about the good things that Joseph and his family had done. All he knows that these people are multiplying, they're increasing, and the text literally says the land swarmed with them. Have you ever seen a swarm before? Insects or you've seen what happens to bunny rabbits, right? And you just let them go. They just seem to multiply. Next thing you know, they're all over the place. And that's sort of what's happening here. The Israelites are swarming the land. They're all over the place. And he becomes afraid of them. If war breaks out, they may ally themselves with the enemy, and they may fight against us, and then they'll leave. And then what are we going to do? And so, in order to bring them into check, it says he afflicts them with hard labor. He's going to demoralize them. He's going to weaken them. And look what happens. Verse 12. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. No matter what they did, they continued to get stronger. The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor, in mortar and bricks and all kinds of labor in the field, all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. Made their lives bitter. Have you ever known anyone who felt bitter about life? I can imagine it was so hard. The Israelites, all they could see in their mind, all they could see for the future was nothing but bricks and mortar and work out in the field. It didn't look like life would change for them, and yet they continued to multiply. And it says that the Egyptians were in dread of them. So this isn't working. Trying to afflict them with hard labor, trying to bring them into check, they just continue to grow, and now they're in dread with them. So Pharaoh comes up with a plan B. Let's go ahead and continue reading in verse 15. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other who was named Puah. And he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. Okay, so these midwives, as they go out and assist these people, they're supposed to put the male children to death. That's going to nip this growth thing in the bud, and that's going to bring them into check. But notice what happens in verse 17. The midwives feared, not Pharaoh, right? The midwives feared God, and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. And so the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and let the boys live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. All right. So they didn't go through with this. They were not about to kill these innocent babies because they feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. And Pharaoh realizes that they're still multiplying. Why are you letting them live? And so they were kind of a little bit deceitful, weren't they? Well, before we get there, those Hebrew women, they're a lot stronger than we are. They're a lot more robust than we are. They're really good at having babies. And so, by the time we get there, the baby has already arrived. Is what they did okay? Did God approve of what they did? Well, let's go ahead and continue to read. So, God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. Because the midwives feared God, He established households for them. And so God was good to them. Because they preserved the families of these Hebrews, God established the families of the midwives. And you know what? These women took great risk. They disobeyed Pharaoh, who was sovereign over the land. He could have had them put to death. And so they did this at great risk to themselves. But the text says that they didn't fear Pharaoh. They feared God, and they were going to do what was right, regardless of what Pharaoh told them. And so God approved of their actions because of their fear of God. But we also see approval in a very subtle way in the way that the text tells the story here. Who are the most evil despot, the most evil rulers throughout human history? I went and looked it up online, and you know, these people are always the ones that were at the top of the list. Number one, always, right, is always Hitler. And it's usually followed by Stalin and often by Mao Zedong. And so, and you know, people in ancient times probably would have added to the list somebody like Herod the Great. Remember when he went and had all the babies killed in order to try and have the king of the Jews put to death, and so just kill them all, and that'll get them. And ancient people would have also put Pharaoh on the list as well because of what he does here in trying to have all these children put to death. But the question is, who is he? You know, historians have been trying, and they're not all in agreement as to which of the Pharaoh, when you go back and look at all the king list, which Pharaoh is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and they're not all in agreement. And the reason is because the text doesn't actually name him. We're not 100% for sure which Pharaoh this was. He's just a nameless person with a title in here. And you would think somebody as evil as he was, you would think somebody like that, we would at least have his name, but the text is not interested in highlighting him. But we do have the names of those two women who stood up to him, who disobeyed him, who feared God more than Pharaoh and spared the lives of these children, Shiphrah and Puah. And we know their names, and their names are now etched in history. And so God approves of these two heroines. It would have been safer for them to follow Pharaoh's orders, but they chose to do the right thing rather than the safe thing. And you know, history is full of people who did that very thing. They chose to do the right thing rather than the safe thing. We may think of people throughout history, such as the people that sheltered Jews during the years of Nazi Germany. Matter of fact, they've even made movies about some of these people who did that at great risk to themselves. In the Bible, we read about a woman named Rahab who sheltered two spies of the people of God on her roof when they came looking for them because she wanted to do the right thing and she knew that God was with them. You know, in the Voice of the Martyrs magazine, I read about a man by the name of Zafar Bhatti in Pakistan. He was a man, he was a Christian, and that is against the law. But he was a Christian and decided he was going to do the right thing regardless of what the law said. And so he established a Christian ministry to help the poor, and he continued to do so even amid threats, and he shared Christ at every opportunity. And so he was arrested for blasphemy. He was thrown into prison. He's been beaten there. People have tried to poison him a number of times. And his sister says, and ask everyone to pray for Zafar, that he would remain strong in his faith. And neither he nor his family have any regrets about what they've done because they fear God more than man. And God definitely approves. And so that's what these midwives did. Now, did they turn the tide of what was happening in Egypt? Maybe temporarily, but not in a way that you would think. Maybe just temporarily. Their actions did have an immediate effect. There's no telling how many lives that they saved, how many babies that they saved. In verse 20 it says that the people continued to multiply and they became very mighty. So Pharaoh's plan B has failed. And you would think at this point he would realize that he's fighting a losing cause, right? Well, no. Pharaoh thinks he's divine. He thinks he's a god, and he's not about to give up. And so he comes up with plan C. Notice what it says in the last verse of the chapter. Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. No longer just midwives, no longer just taskmasters, but everyone in my dominion. See those Hebrew people? When you see a baby boy, you need to cast them into the river. You need to put them to death. And so now no place is safe for the Israelites. It seemed like all the midwives were able to do was to postpone the inevitable. What are they going to do? The next part of the story, I think all of us are very familiar with. We learn about it in Sunday school classes. There's sort of a sense of anticipation of what happens next. The story now focuses on one single Hebrew family. Okay, and they know that they've just had a baby and they're in danger. And so what's going to happen? So let's go ahead and continue to read chapter 2. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. Can you imagine? All of your neighbors, all the people you see out on the street could potentially turn you in and have your baby put to death. And so for 3 months, she tried to hide this baby. And you know, babies, when they're that young, aren't always all that quiet, are they? And so she's frantically trying to keep this baby hidden. But, verse 3, when she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket, covered him over with tar and pitch, and then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile. Oh no. Alright, that's the enemy, right? I was hoping somebody else would find it. She comes down to bathe at the Nile with her maidens walking alongside the Nile, and she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. And she had pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Okay. If you didn't know the rest of the story, you may be wondering at this point, is the baby going to live or is the baby going to die? But it says that she had pity on the child. It's just a baby. Just a baby. And so what does she do? Verse 7, her sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women that she may nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." And so the girl went and called the child's mother. And then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." Wow. Talk about all these things working together for the best. And not only does Moses' actual mother get to raise him, but now she gets to be paid for it. So all of these things are working together, and now we begin to expect that something great is about to happen. The people are being enslaved, their babies are being killed, this one was spared, and obviously it has to be for a special reason. So we continue to read in verse 11. It came about in those days when Moses had grown up, that he went out to his brethren. You know, we're talking about the Israelites. He knows that he is an Israelite. So he goes out to his brethren and looked upon their hard labors. Can you imagine what might have been going through his mind at this point? That could have been me. These are my people. Now, I don't know how he was treated in Pharaoh's house, but it was probably obvious that ethnically he probably wasn't an Egyptian. But he realized, he looks upon his people. He identifies with his people. These are his people. And he sees their hard labors. And then it says he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. What is he going to do? Verse 12. So he looked this way and that. And when he saw that there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Moses, I don't know if he just rose up in passion and saw, because he saw one of his own people being beaten by this slave master, and so he strikes him down. He makes a decision. He chooses to identify with his own people rather than to identify with the Egyptians. And we expect that things are now about to change. We have an insider in the house now. Okay, he's not only a Hebrew, but he's an insider with the Egyptians now, and things are about to turn around. Or are they? We continue to read, and we read that nothing changes. Verse 13, he went out the next day, and behold, 2 Hebrews were fighting with each other. And he said to the offender, "Why are you striking your companion?" But he said, "Who made you a prince or judge over us? Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" So Moses was afraid and said, "Surely the matter has become known." Now, I think when Moses came around, I don't think the Israelites were glad to see him. They saw him as an Egyptian. They saw him as a traitor. They didn't see him as one of them. And so this reaction is understandable. And so, but Moses realizes that what he'd done is now known. And so what is he going to do? Verse 15, when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. So he left, ran away, took a long journey. Now he's in a foreign country, foreign place. Verse 16, the priests of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and filled the troughs with water to water his father's flock. Then the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. Okay, Moses is always trying to do the right thing, right? Verse 18, when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, "Why have you come back so soon today?" So they said, "An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and what is more, he even drew the water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he then? Why is it that you have left this man behind? Invite him to have something to eat." Moses was willing to dwell with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses. Then she gave birth to a son and named him Gershom. For he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." Okay, so nothing really changes up to this point. Seems to be a real disappointment. What do we make of all of this? A lot of people at this point, especially preachers, will rush to God's rescue at this point. God knew exactly what he was doing. You know, we know from the beginning that he's going to use Moses to deliver his people. And so, in order for him to face down Pharaoh, he needed to be an insider in the house. He had the finest Egyptian education, but in order to lead them through the wilderness, he needed to give him Desert Survival 101. And so he brings them all the way out through the desert, and so he spends the next 40 years out in the desert learning how to live in the desert. And so God knew exactly what he was doing, and God is involved in everything that's happening here. And that makes a great sermon. But if you look at the first 2 chapters of Exodus, there's very little intervention by God, if at all. We know that he was good to the midwives because they chose to do the right things. But other than that, we see no intervention by God at all. And we've been reading from Genesis all the way up to here, that's a stark contrast, because just prior to this, as we're reading the stories of Joseph, God's everywhere, isn't he? God is always the one that blesses Joseph. God is always the one that makes him the number 1 man in the house. And the text is very explicit in saying that God did this sort of thing. But we don't see anything like that here in the first 2 chapters of Exodus. When we leave the first 2 chapters of Exodus, God becomes a central figure of the story. He's behind everything that happens, but not in these first 2 chapters of Exodus. God is conspicuously silent here. And so I think it does an injustice to the way this is written to say that God was directly responsible for what happens in the first 2 chapters. It's too simple and too neat to simply say that all of this somehow was God's will. And I get a little bit uncomfortable when people start speaking for God and say, well, some tragedy happened, well, it was God's will. Really? Was it God's will that all these babies be killed? Was it God's will that all the massive numbers of people be killed during World War II, during the Holocaust? Was it God's will for people to be, Christians in other parts of the world, to be tortured and maimed and thrown into prison, to have their children killed and their eyes gouged out? Is all of that really God's will? We need to be careful not to become too presumptuous and to think we know what we know, when in fact we may not know what we think we know. Here's what I see as I look at this text. The text in the first 2 chapters of Exodus attributes almost nothing to God and attributes everything else to human effort. Can you see that? Almost none of that effort is attributed to God, but it is attributed to humans. By human effort, these midwives temporarily saved some of the Hebrew babies. By human effort, Moses was spared from death. By human effort, Moses rescued a single Hebrew slave. And now by human effort, Moses is a stranger out in the desert. And so here's a lesson in all this. Human effort all by itself is futile. Because we continue to read that even when Pharaoh dies, verse 23, came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage. And they cried out. That's all they could do. All of the human effort, and it didn't seem to rescue them. And all they could do at this point is cry out. But it says their cry of help because of their bondage rose up to God. What can they do? Their would-be deliverer, who delivered one slave from being beaten, is now a stranger living out in the middle of nowhere in the desert. 80 years go by, and they're still in bondage. They're still being afflicted with cruel labors. They're still being beaten, and all they can do at this point is just cry out. Imagine 80 years being in slavery. But guess what? God has good ears. It says all they could do was cry out, and their cry rose up to God, and God hears their cry. Verse 24, so God heard their groaning, and God remembered His covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them. God has good hearing. God has a good memory, because He remembered His promise, He remembered His covenant. And God has good eyes. He sees what they're going through. Of course, the question still remains. I mean, for us, it's just 2 chapters in a book, right? How long does it take to read 2 chapters in the Bible? For them, it was 80 years. Why does God wait so long before He finally does something? And that's a question. That's one of those God questions. The text doesn't actually answer that question. That's a question that we have. And the question, why does God wait so long? Where was He during this time? Well, we know that God was within hearing distance. We know that God hears. We know that God sees. We know that God remembers. And I think if anything we want to take away from these first 2 chapters, first of all, is that human effort fails. Okay? And what these people needed was not more human effort. Sometimes we think that if we just try harder, that somehow trying harder is going to make things better. But we know that human effort all by itself is doomed to fail. We need God. What they needed was not more human effort. What they needed was a Redeemer. And that's the same for every single one of us. We need a Redeemer. That's why Jesus came to this earth. That's why God sent Jesus to die for us, to redeem us from our sins. There's nothing we can do in and of ourselves about it. We need a Redeemer. He died on the cross for your sin, which separated you from God, and He rose from the grave in order to give you life and hope and forgiveness. I think the second lesson we see in this is don't despair. Things will get bad. Things do get bad. Whoever said that if you become a Christian and you follow Christ, that life is always going to be good for you, that life is going to be prosperous, haven't stepped back and looked at the bigger picture. All you got to do is read the book of Acts and realize that that's not true. All you got to do is read about Elijah and Moses here and other people in the Bible to know that that is not true. Things will get really bad, and they do get bad. Matter of fact, I've heard people talk about even in our own country, things are starting to get worse and even hostile toward us. I've been reading about how a lot of Christian-based services have been closing over the last couple of years. People that used to adopt children out to families that were Christian-based are no longer able to do so because they won't adopt to same-sex couples. People that were involved in benevolent shepherds and feeding people won't do so, or not allowed to do so, are actually not able to get food from some of the sources they did before because they're Christian-based. Counselors in some places are no longer can legally counsel minors that are dealing with confusion in their gender identity because, according to some people, that's considered abuse. It seems like the world is becoming more and more antagonistic toward Christianity every day. Are Christians really an endangered species, as some people suggest? People are wringing their hands and say, oh, we've lost the culture wars, we're going to lose it. I remember back in I'm trying to remember what year it was, back in 94, we went and visited one of the countries in the former Soviet Union, and we found a group of Christians there. We went there to establish a church, okay? We found that there was already a church there. And when their Christians had been meeting and serving and working all throughout the years when they were the Soviet Union. And they were strong in their faith, and it was kind of humbling. We thought, this is a place where God, you can't find God anywhere, and yet we found congregations of the Lord's church in several different places. Jesus said that the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church. Whether it's a Soviet Union, whether it's antagonism and hostility towards Christians, nothing, Jesus says, will prevail against the church. The amazing thing as we look is that oftentimes a church at her best and at her strongest is when the church is persecuted. Isn't that amazing? The church at her best is when the church is persecuted. And so let's remember, Jesus said finally, just before He left, the last thing He says in the book of Matthew is, surely I am with you always. And I can imagine the disciples remembered that when they were thrown into prison. The disciples remembered that when they were beaten. The disciples remembered that when they started casting stones at them. And nothing turned them away from their commitment to Christ. And some people may look on with horror and think, how in the world could God allow that to happen? But they knew the bigger picture. What can man do to me? Very little that man could actually do to me. I fear God, not man. Remember that He is Emmanuel. He is God with us. And the Bible says that we have received a kingdom that will never be shaken. Someday God is going to shake the whole world, it says in the book of Hebrews, but the kingdom will never be shaken. So remember these words, especially if we face in a situation where we're tempted to say, where is God? Why isn't He doing something? We may not know why God isn't doing anything what we think He should do at this present time, but we do know that God is present. We do know that God hears. We do know that God remembers His faithfulness toward us. And we do know that God has placed a hope before us. No matter what they do to us, we know how this is going to come out in the end. And all of this, as we look back, is going to be nothing more than a drop in the bucket. When we read through Exodus, when we read through the Old Testament, we remember God coming to dwell with His people, right? We remember God delivering His people. We remember God performing mighty acts and delivering them and facing down Pharaoh and showing that He's more powerful than all the gods of Egypt. We remember all those things, but we don't remember those 2 little chapters at the beginning of Exodus, do we? Now for them that was 80 years, but now looking back it's just 2 chapters in a story. And the ending of the story is that God has delivered us and He's with us, and that's the perspective we need to keep in mind. We're going to go ahead and sing a song this morning. And if you believe that Jesus Christ came and died on the cross for your sins and you're ready to accept Him as your Lord and as your Savior, then you're ready to come and be baptized and let Him wash away all of your sins. And so if you need to respond to the invitation this morning, please come as we stand and sing.